guys, so I think one of my favorite things about these supplemental episodes at this point is that I have no idea what's going on. And by that I mean, like, I don't even know what title this video has right now, because I was trying to look at my last 5 supplemental books and try to figure out like what the theme was or whatever. There is no theme. I am all over the place right now. I don't even know how to explain this to you. So the best thing I can do is just say that I think maybe 3 of the books you can relate, and the other 2 are just kind of off in the wilderness of why is it even here. And so I'll start with the 2 books that are just like, huh? So that when we can talk about the more like legitimate history books. But I struggled whether or not I would even include it in these videos, because it's probably the first time that politics and history in some way, shape, or form has not really factored majorly into the story. So let me explain. The book that I'm talking about is Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montel. Amanda Montel is also famous for a book she published called Word Slut, and Cultish is her second book. So Amanda Montel is a linguist, and this book, shockingly, is about the language of fanaticism. So how we, on a language level, believe in cults. And her point is, while we are very familiar with cults like Jonestown, we actually use a lot of the same rhetorical language when we talk about things that maybe we wouldn't consider cults. Like, for example, CrossFit. Like when we really like one brand of clothes or shoes. Like, are you a Swiftie because you listen to Taylor Swift music? So for me, why I decided to consider this book for these videos is because as we are considering, political parties, there are some facets, this, fanaticism, this like cultish behavior, people who are just fundamental belief, like people are like, how do people get caught up in all of this stuff? And so what I thought this book might be an interesting view into is what, on the level of language, the language that we use and language devices that we use, or the way that we interpret language when it's told to us, right? Because people don't just up and believe that some person they've only just heard of is like the Messiah, right? There are steps that bring you closer and closer, or deeper and deeper into some of these communities. I do think that on the language level, I got that from this book. I think it's really interesting. What she does is she uses that progression of stories of legitimate cults you might be more familiar with, and then kind of bringing it towards like a more everyday use of these rhetorical language devices and the ways that we talk about these things. Unfortunately, just in terms of how enjoyable the book was, what that also means is that there are these really intense, crazy chapters up front, and by the time you get to the sections about like CrossFit or MLM schemes, you're like, okay. And it doesn't mean it's not important, because like I said, this in one way goes the opposite way for people who are potentially going to slide towards something more serious. One of the first gateway steps is kind of normalizing this culty language in everyday use. However, because the book is set up that way, it means that by the time you get to the end, you're like, okay, you've made your point, like I'm done. It is worthwhile reading. It does not particularly touch on politics or history, except in the sense of these cult movements that she talks about, some very famous ones in the beginning. I am not a person who does a lot of true crime or cult, like any of this stuff. So for me, a lot of it was new information. It may not be for you if it's something that you are interested in. However, I've never really seen anything attend to language in this way. So if you're interested in the language that we use on a daily basis, as I am, it's part of my PhD, it might be an interesting book for you. And I think it'll serve as good background knowledge when we have these discussions about cults and, political cults, but I mean, it didn't actually touch on anything specifically political. So I don't know. I'm still glad that I read it, and I think that it fits in here, but it just, the path to get there is confusing. So the other book that I want to talk about is a bit more related, and this is Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom by Carl Bernstein. Now, if you watched, for example, my Nixon supplementals episode, or, you know anything about Watergate, All the President's Men, Carl Bernstein is one of the two famous Washington Post reporters who broke some of the biggest Watergate news, along with Bob Woodward. Now, Carl Bernstein, I don't feel personally like I've heard as much from him recently as I have from Bob Woodward, who has still been putting out these crazy books on the Trump administration. So when I saw that Carl Bernstein was writing a memoir, I was like, oh, that could be fun. It's different, and I don't know a lot about journalism. It's not something I have a particular interest in, but as someone who has been in the business, I think we talk a lot about what news is today. And so I thought this book might be an interesting look at the evolution of news media through Carl Bernstein's eyes, as someone who really does believe in the investigative journalism side of this. So again, it's important for me to mention that I'm not passionate about journalism, right? Like, I respect the industry, I respect the people that do it, but I don't have deeply passionate feelings about, doing it or making it or whatever. And so it was really crazy to me as I was reading Bernstein's book, how much joy I got from the passages and how much he really conveyed how much he enjoyed what he was doing and how passionate he was about his job. He starts in the newsroom essentially as fast as he can, as soon as he gets his working papers. He doesn't even want to finish high school. He doesn't want to go to college. Like, for him, news is it. And that really, really came. I was listening to the audiobook. I don't know if that helped, but I got excited with him about being a reporter and being a journalist, even though that's not something I've ever considered for myself. And secondly, I really underestimated how many big moments Carl Bernstein witnessed. He was on the mall for Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. He was almost caught up in a riot. He did a lot of jobs that were really on the edges of big historical moments prior to Watergate. And so that was cool, seeing, a big speech by JFK, seeing JFK's inauguration, like I said, MLK's speech, through the eyes of a really young kid who is not only learning about how much power he can use with his job, but just learning more and more about the world itself. So I kind of went into it with lukewarm expectations, but I really enjoyed it. My only complaint is that it ended, and this is before he even joins the staff of the Washington Post, and I was like, no, just keep going, like, just keep telling me about all of this stuff. And I know I've read their books about breaking the Watergate story. I know that's there, but there was something about this that it just really caught my imagination. And so if it's something that you're interested in, even just for a casual read, I highly recommend it. Moving on to something that is not a casual read. Let's talk about The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family by Annette Gordon-Reed. So Annette Gordon-Reed is one of, if not the foremost scholar on Sally Hemings in particular. She has also done tons of other important stuff. If you are not aware who Sally Hemings is, Sally Hemings was the African-American enslaved mistress of Thomas Jefferson, writer of the Declaration of Independence and our third president. And what Hemmings of Monticello is, what Annette Gordon-Reed is trying to do here, is tell the story of an entire family. And an entire family through their life at Monticello, which was Thomas Jefferson's estate and plantation. So starting with the first Hemmings who came to Monticello, who was sold to Thomas Jefferson, came there through when he got married to his wife and was moved to the plantation. Now, there is a lot of family tied up in this. So Sally Hemmings was actually the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, just, not recognized because she was the daughter of a slave. And so this story really is about family and these family ties and the way this family has to adapt and deal with this existence where it's quite possible that Martha Jefferson knew Sally Hemmings was her half-sister. It's all a mess, right? So it's very complicated. But the problem with this book, just on like a writing level, is that it is so dense. This is not a casual read. It is just, there is so much here. And while it tries to go mostly chronological because it is following individual lives, you do a lot of backtracking, right? Because you follow Elizabeth Hemmings and then you follow the lives of her children and right, a lot of those are running parallel. And when you go on to the grandchildren, a lot of those are running parallel. So it's a lot of kind of going back and forth. And also Annette Gordon-Reed does this thing a lot where she's like, this is the decision that was made. And so you could say that, she does a lot of arguing on behalf of the other side and kind of disproving the arguments. And again, I understand why in this book that might be very complicated. It is a book about trying to show the nuances of the slave system in Virginia. But again, it just becomes really, really dense and hard to read. And it is really just hard to get through. So while I deeply appreciated this book, I really wish that I wasn't listening to the audiobook, first of all, because there was just so much and I couldn't go back and look and reference. And I don't know, maybe if I had been able to underline as I was going, maybe I would have been more engaged, but I was just kind of really just waiting for this book to end, to be honest. Again, it's very important. I read it to fulfill a Pop Sugar challenge for a specific award winner. I don't regret it, but I just wish I had known going into it just how dense it would be, because doing that while trying to also do my PhD work, it was just not a good mix. So a slightly related book that in a way almost had an opposite problem is a new release, The Last Slave Ship, The True Story of How Clotilda Was Found, Her Descendants, and an Extraordinary Reckoning by Ben Raine. So if you are not familiar with the story of the Clotilda, this is the last known slave ship, hence the title, that entered American waters. So this is actually before the Civil War, but at this point, importing slaves is already illegal. And there's this rich white guy and he's kind of dared and he says, well, I think I can get slaves from Africa. And so he sends off this ship captain to go get slaves and bring them back. And the whole point is not necessarily, he doesn't really need to have gotten these people and torn them from their homeland, but he does it basically on a dare for the money that he will make. And what is important about Clotilda is that we know the ship, we know the captain, and we know the manifest. This is one of the few slaving ships to whom descendants of the Clotilda captives can, they can trace all the way back and actually figure out, for the most part, a lot of work has been done on this, what tribes they came from, where in Africa they came from. And so it's one of the best examples of actually being able to trace heritage all the way back. So it's a crazy story. I can't tell you all of it. There's also a documentary from National Geographic about this ship on Disney Plus if you want to watch it. But this is a story of how this ship was found. So people have been looking for it ever since essentially it docked, because the initial guy who financed it and the captain, they just kind of, ran their mouths off about what they had accomplished. And when they had brought the ship back, they brought it into a river and burned it. And people have been looking for it ever since. Everybody tried to tell other people that it was somewhere else so they couldn't find it and prove they had done this. But a couple of years ago, we finally found it. And this is a book by the guy who eventually brought deep divers to where it was. And so it's the story of the ship, of the captives, of their descendants, and of the process of finding the ship, of the town they founded, Africa Town. This book is really concise. There isn't a lot of detail in it. And the back half really is all about Ben Raines being like, and this is how I found it, which is fine. He deserves that credit, I guess. But it does make for a really fast and interesting read about a moment in our history that kind of encapsulates and crystallizes a lot of the issues at the time and also the issues that we are still grappling with as a country. It's very fast, it's very exciting, and like I said, there's a documentary about it as well that actually speaks to some of the descendants. So that ship, for all I know, I think it's still in the water. They still have to try to bring it out, but it's a very present archaeological find with a very fascinating and relevant backstory. So the complete opposite of the Hemmingses of Monticello. It is definitely just for engaging, quickly moving nonfiction book. So finally, I want to talk about a book that you would be like, American history, Gretchen, why is this here? The Last King of America, The Misunderstood Reign of George III by Andrew Roberts. Again, tangential relationship, right? George III is the king during the American Revolution, kind of considered the cause of it. Here's the thing, this book is written for an American audience. Andrew Roberts, I believe, is English, and this is about obviously an English king, but he is directing this entire book at Americans. Specifically, this book is Lin-Manuel Miranda's fault. He actually talks about it in the introduction, watching Hamilton and just seeing the portrayal of George III there and going like, this is not right. Like, this cannot be what Americans really have to say about George III. And this cannot be his legacy. So he literally watched Hamilton and went, I'm going to write an 800, 900 page biography to debunk American myths about George III. So George III, is blamed a lot for the American Revolution. Roberts kind of complicates that discussion. George III also goes insane. He complicates that discussion. There's a lot more that we know now about the mental illness that he was suffering from and what kind of happened there. And also, a couple of years ago, the British Crown opened George III's papers to the public. So Roberts is able to actually use, across the entire biography, primary sources from the king in many places to illustrate Roberts' own points about how the king really felt about the revolution, how he really felt about America, and what he was really like as he began to get sicker and sicker towards the end of his life. It's long. It was too long for me for what I was there for, which really was the pieces that tied into American politics. There was a lot of names, like, prime ministers and governments under him that come and go. And again, in an audiobook, you can't really track those. So for me, this book was a very up and down experiences where there were some sections that I was keenly interested in, and then some sections I just could not have cared less about. But again, it comes up again in the epilogue where part of it, I think, is that Roberts was most interested in the parts of this book that would speak to an American audience. Because again, it comes up in the epilogue again that he is directly addressing American characteristics and characterizations of George III and our understanding of him in relation to the American Revolution. So on the one hand, I was like, why did you bother with an entire biography if this was really what you cared about? But again, he's just trying to recreate George III's image for American audiences. I don't know how this would be seen in the British context, even though it's a biography of their ruler, past ruler. I don't know, it's very funny. But if you happen to see it on like a shelf, I highly recommend just reading like the intro and the epilogue just for how mad Robert is at Lin-Manuel Miranda. So I'm not sad that I read it. I did learn a lot, and it was really interesting to see the American Revolution from the other side of the ocean, from that context. But I probably could have done without like 2/3 of it. So if that is of interest to you, I think you'll enjoy it, but you know, it's long. It's long. If you want fast, exciting reads, Cultish, Kid in the Newsroom, and The Last Slave Ship. If you want 800 to 1,000 page slogs, Hemmingses of Monticello, and The Last King of America. Sometimes, I mean, I love big books, I do, but just these two just were not doing it for me. Anyways, I'm done. That's 5 books that make no sense, but they're the last 5 books that I've read from my supplementals. As always, you can catch up with back episodes, or, you know, just follow, like, and subscribe and see what absolute nonsense I read next for this. Thanks, guys. Bye.